Like I said, though, I want to start off the show today by talking about the Denver Nuggets, who seemed like everybody in the national media was counting out after dropping both of their home games to start off this series against the Minnesota Timberwolves. I understand the Timberwolves are this very exciting young team. Anthony Edwards seems like he is poised to be potentially the next face of the NBA, but a lot of people were calling for the sweep and saying that the Nuggets had no choice. Now, what I will say is that Jamal Murray definitely did not look healthy headed into this weekend, which was a real concern. But even myself, who had faith in the Nuggets coming into this series, I didn't rule them out, but I did do a little exercise on Friday talking about this was on Thursday, talking about what the playoffs and this reputation would sort of do to the Denver Nuggets if they were to drop this series badly. And now we see what happens when a true championship team gets backed into a corner. They respond. And we know that Jokic is always going to be great. That is just a given at this point. But it was the others stepping up. Like I mentioned, Jamal Murray. It was really concerning, his level of play coming into these past couple games. We saw him basically throwing a tantrum in game 2 based off of the whole throwing the heat pack situation, constantly yelling at the referees, and he was just entirely uncomfortable during the first couple games in this series. And he comes back and he looked very comfortable. He hit some ridiculous shots in this game. That was a nice response, but it wasn't just him. We saw Aaron Gordon running the offense for Denver, especially in some of those non-Jokic minutes that we'll be getting to shortly here as well. I think that the development of Justin Holiday, who was basically out of the rotation for that series against the Lakers, averaged just 7 minutes per game. He's come in and made a big impact for them. He shot 10 of 16 from 3 so far in this series, playing 19 minutes per game. He's pretty much taken over those Peyton Watson minutes, and I like Watson a lot because of some of the defensive intensity that he brings, but Holiday is scoring right now and making a very big impact for this Nuggets team as they destroy the Timberwolves in Game 3, and then last night was Game 4. They win that one 115-107. But we have just seen this Denver Nuggets offense that we obviously know has been tremendous over the past couple of years. They are facing one of the best defenses we've seen in the NBA in recent history with the Timberwolves, but the way that they were sort of able to recollect themselves after dropping those first couple games and respond the way that they have has been massive. I was specifically impressed with the way that at times it seemed like the pace they were playing at. We've seen Minnesota try and send these full court pressures at the Nuggets coming up the court. That's specifically how I think that Jamal Murray was knocked off of his game a little bit in those first couple games in Denver. But he's come back. I thought that he and Aaron Gordon as well, there was one possession as well where he was inbounding and he took it all the way up himself, and both he and Murray in a couple of these instances were able to beat their defender off the initial move, get them sort of behind them, and then create a numbers mismatch, generating looks for themselves and their teammates at the rim. So kind of using this Minnesota intense defensive pressure against them in order to get some looks for themselves. And again, these were in some non-Jokic minutes that I just was really blown away by the adjustment that the Nuggets have made in these situations. And I do think that they have sort of taken advantage of these full court presses in a different way as well. The fact that the Wolves are kind of just hurting themselves. There were some really stupid fouls from Rudy Gobert, Karl Anthony Towns, and Naz Reid. They're three big men that get the most playing time. It was just absurd to me to see on a few instances these guys, whether it was at the half-court line or in the backcourt, picking up these dumb fouls, trying to press Jokic all the way up the court. And it was just mind-boggling to me. And there was this one instance, it was literally 2 minutes into the game, Rudy Gobert ended up getting a blocking foul against Jokic right at the half-court line just about in that corner. And Reggie Miller was praising Gobert for the type of intensity and pressure he was trying to put against Jokic. But I don't know. I feel like I would prefer to have my number one defender not in foul trouble. And we saw Gobert end up dealing with foul trouble late in this game. He was dealing with 5 by the end of this. And I believe that played a role as to why he wasn't able to be quite as aggressive against Jokic in particular. And we saw Jokic being able to take Naz Reid in the post by himself a lot down the stretch because Gobert wasn't available quite as much. Now, offensive limitations definitely played a role in that as well, which we will get to later in this segment. But I just think that a lot of the times we see the Timberwolves just getting in their own way. And for as promising as they are, and I don't think that they are going anywhere in terms of, falling out of the playoffs, whether it's this season and they make a potential finals run or going forward here, this is going to be a Minnesota team that should be prominent for the foreseeable future. And we've talked about this at length on the show prior, talking about Karl Anthony Towns specifically and some of his fouling tendencies that drive me crazy personally, but his whole team just sort of not being able to get out of their own way. And another instance of these self-inflicted wounds was the end of the first half in this Game 4 matchup where, the Timberwolves were being outplayed pretty much the entire first half. Anthony Edwards was the only one who really had offense going for himself. There was that stretch at the beginning of the second quarter where we saw these non-Jokic minutes actually, in favor of the Nuggets, where they outscored the Timberwolves 12-2 in those first couple minutes with Jokic on the bench, which is something that we haven't seen from the Nuggets all year, really be able to hold themselves together with Jokic on the bench. But all that considered, it's a 7-point game with 30 seconds left. Kentavious Caldwell-Pope knocks down a 3, sort of so be it, that'll happen. But now it's a 10-point game. It seems like, okay, you can sort of keep this together, potentially even with the final possession, make it a single-digit game, and instead you have Anthony Edwards start his drive maybe a tad early, but he ends up turning the ball over. Nuggets run the court, get Michael Porter Jr. a dunk for another 2, and then Nickeil Alexander-Walker at that point just concede the half again, but he just whips the ball all the way up the court. Bad pass, Murray steals it, and then knocks down that 55-footer from the half-court line. Pretty funny moment there, him sort of celebrating with the announcers in that moment. And at that point, it just seemed like this was going to be the Nuggets game. And I believe it was because of some of these mental mistakes from the Timberwolves. So, like I sort of alluded to earlier, the level of offensive production outside of Anthony Edwards is definitely a concern for the Timberwolves. Edwards is tremendous. He ends up scoring 44 points in this game, 16 of 25 from the field, 5 of 8 from 3. But, like I said, early on in this game, it was clear that he was basically going to have to do everything for them, and it's because the likes of Karl Anthony Towns was just unable to get the job done. He missed his first 7 shots, was 1 of 10, and he got himself going at least a little bit early in that third quarter, but just a fall off from the first 2 games to what we've seen in the past couple. And it is concerning because they really do need him to produce offensively. They don't have necessarily a third scorer because you look at who is technically their third option. Gobert has been their third leading scorer in the postseason so far, in large part, at least if you look at last night, because of the fact that the Nuggets aren't afraid to foul him down the stretch and sort of take points away. Gobert was fine from the free throw line. I believe he finished 5 of 9, if I can double check myself here on the fly. Yeah, 5 of 9. So able to at least get his numbers up a little bit. He finishes with 11. And, outside of that, we know he and Jaden McDaniels are both limited offensively. Naz Reid is a good option off the bench, their fourth leading scorer, and early on it seemed like he was going to be the option for them. He comes in, immediately hits a three. In the second quarter, he got himself to the rim a handful of times for some dunks and layups, but he only ends up taking 6 shots in this game. And we saw, again, like I mentioned, on the defensive side, Jokic was just so unafraid of him in that post-up matchup. So this is where we really need to see Towns be able to come out and be an impact player for this team. I still think that he can be. We know it, but the level of consistency with him can just be really frustrating because he is such a great offensive talent, and we've seen some of these steps in terms of his maturity to understand playing the team game more. But maybe it's an example of this team just being, I wouldn't even call it slightly ahead of schedule. I would say that this would be ahead of schedule definitively if it weren't for the fact that they went in and traded everything they did for Rudy Gobert. The front office sort of sped up the timeline a little bit. Now, Anthony Edwards still just 22 years old. Towns as well. I want to say that he's 26, 27 years old. So it's not like this team, like I mentioned, I think they are going to be prominent for the next handful of years, and I'm not concerned about their future necessarily, but there is just a little bit to this whole idea of, I don't know if they are necessarily ready to dethrone the champs. And on the Nuggets side of this, I mean, they were not good these first couple games, and yeah, you can somewhat blame it on Jamal Murray not being fully healthy, but even still, Jokic seemed, at least in game one, like a more human version of himself. They've gotten massive performances from Aaron Gordon over the past couple games where, like I mentioned, he is with the ball in his hands, making decisions. He's knocking down threes as well. That is massive for them because they need to be able to find a way to get Rudy Gobert off of the court. And I actually thought that Gobert had a couple instances last night at least where he was on the perimeter playing defense against Jamal Murray and actually holding up for himself. But again, it's this idea of, we saw pretty much all year, and even going back to last postseason, if you will, that baseline play where Jokic has it in the post, and if he's one-on-one, he's going to take it himself, and if the help defender comes, Aaron Gordon is sort of hanging out right on that baseline for the lobs, and they don't necessarily have that same opportunity because of the fact that Minnesota has so much size between Karl Anthony Towns and Rudy Gobert. Now that Gordon is able to space himself out a little bit more, and I know that game 2 was ugly. It definitely wasn't Gordon's best game himself either. But that was another game where he came out in the first quarter and he knocked down a couple threes for himself, and it seemed like that was maybe something to build off of. Now again, that was Jamal Murray was completely taken out of that game, but we are seeing some real signs of improvement here for Denver, that they are who we thought they were initially. And I know that it is very easy to get caught up in all of the drama and of, again, this exciting young team that I think most NBA fans are rooting for, and to some degree everybody is sort of anti-champion. Now, I really enjoy the brand of basketball the Nuggets play, so I have a little bit of rooting interest for them. I might have also put a little bit of money on them after they lost game 1, so I have a little bit of an invested interest in the Nuggets coming out to win this as well. But I think that ultimately, I wouldn't say the series is over by any means for Minnesota. They need to sort of settle themselves down, especially on that defensive end, because they're not going to win the offensive shootouts with Denver. We saw in the last couple games when Denver's offense is really firing on all cylinders, Timberwolves just don't necessarily have that same firepower to match the Timberwolves. So, I guess I kind of hated how I was leaning with the Timberwolves after game 2, because how can you not really, as it's now being sort of publicized. There have been only five times in NBA history a team has come back from down 0-2 after dropping both games at home. I actually went in and I found those exact 5 examples. We mentioned this before on the show. It was the Clippers over the Mavericks in 2021. It was the Celtics over the Bulls in 2017. 2005, it was the Rockets over the Mavericks. 1994, the Rockets over the Suns. And 1993, the Suns over the Lakers in actually a 5-game series. So they had to win 3 straight games, couldn't afford to lose. So maybe I'll have to go back at some point and sort of more deeply analyze those specific series to see if we can discover some sort of pattern here. But I think that ultimately here, the Nuggets are a team that are more than capable of pulling off the odds. We saw in 2021 them able to, or it was 2020, off the top of my head I'm blanking a little bit, but I want to say it was the bubble playoffs where they came back from multiple 3-1 deficits in order to move on in the playoffs. So we know that this team has championship pedigree, and they are able to not necessarily... I feel like they were kind of sleepwalking a little bit through the beginning of the playoffs, and in large part it had to do with the fact that Jamal Murray was dealing with these injuries, but they seem to be back. Last kind of note here, very, very small, but I did notice at the end of the game that the Nuggets decided to run with Christian Braun in those closing minutes instead of Michael Porter Jr. MPJ briefly got subbed in at the end in order to be on the court in case there was an intentional foul situation and there were free throws on the line. But it was Braun who was in the game, and I think most specifically it was to try and play defense against Anthony Edwards. He forced a missed layup with about a minute left, so something that caught my eye. Curious whether that does develop into anything bigger, but ultimately, we got an even series here. This is coming back to Denver with a chance to take the series lead once again. But let me know in the comment section what your thoughts on the rest of this series are. We're going to be taking our first break right now, and when we come back on the other side, I want to dive into the other series that we saw get evened up over the weekend, where the New York Knicks dropped 2 consecutive to the Indiana Pacers as they continue to deal with these injuries and the fatigue. So I want to touch on that. But first, a quick break. We will be right back.